A woman stood watching as soldiers tied her husband's hands behind his back. They marched him to the edge of the Volov River, the same river where he had fished every single morning for 20 years. They pushed him in. When he came up gasping for air, they forced him back under with long poles. She screamed. Then they tied her hands. Then they tied her children to her, and they threw all of them into the river together. The soldiers who did this were not foreign invaders. They were not enemies from across a border. They spoke the same language as that woman. They prayed in the same churches. They served the same crown. They had been sent by their own Tsar, and they were just getting started. Here is a question that almost nobody ever stops to ask. What actually happens when a ruler decides that his own people are the enemy? Not a foreign kingdom, not an army gathering at the border. His own cities, his own clergy, his own merchants, and their families, and their children. In December 1569, Tsar Ivan IV gathered a column of 6,000 of his personal enforcers and marched them north through the brutal Russian winter toward the city of Novgorod. But along the way, they did not stop to rest. They did not stop to rest apply. They stopped at every town in their path to practice. In Klin, they killed without distinction. In Fur, they looted monasteries and executed priests. They poisoned wells. They burned grain stores in the middle of winter, knowing exactly what that meant for the families who depended on them. By the time they reached the outskirts of Novgorod, the snow behind them was no longer white. But this was not mindless destruction. That is what makes this story different from every other massacre in Russian history. Every single killing along that route served a specific purpose: to guarantee that by the time Ivan arrived at Novgorod, nobody inside the city would even think about resisting. And nobody did. This is the story of how a government destroys a city from the inside, and what remains when the full machinery of a state has finished with it. To understand what happened at Novgorod, you first have to understand the specific kind of mind that ordered it. Ivan Vasilievich became Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3 after his father died in 1533. His mother ruled as regent for 5 years until she too died. Ivan was 8 years old. What mattered most about the years that followed was this: the boyars, Russia's feudal nobility, ran everything. Ivan held the title, they held the power, and they made absolutely certain he understood that arrangement. Ivan would later write that as a child he and his brother were fed late, or sometimes not at all. He described wearing threadbare clothes while boyars walked around him in furs. He described moments when nobles would sit on his dead father's bed, put their feet up, and stare at him while doing so. Now it is worth pausing here. These are Ivan's own words, written decades later, when he had every reason to paint his childhood as a justification for what he would one day do. We cannot verify every detail. What we can verify is the political reality: a child ruler surrounded by aristocratic factions who treated the throne as something to be fought over. At 13, Ivan made his first independent decision as a ruler. He ordered the arrest of Prince Andrei Shuisky, the most powerful boyar in Moscow. Shuisky was handed to the palace kennel keepers, who killed him. Whether Ivan specifically ordered the killing or simply allowed it to happen is still debated. What is not debated is that every single boyar in Moscow understood the message. In 1547, at 16 years old, Ivan was crowned not as Grand Prince, but as Tsar. The title was deliberate. It came from Caesar. It meant something entirely different from every title that had come before it: that the ruler of Russia governed not by the permission of his nobility, but by divine authority. For the next 13 years, Ivan ruled in a way that historians describe as his good period. He reformed the legal code. He established Russia's first representative assembly. He conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, dramatically expanding Russian territory. He opened trade with England. But two specific events cracked the foundation of that stability. In 1553, Ivan fell gravely ill and believed he was dying. He asked his boyars to swear loyalty to his infant son. Several refused outright. Others hesitated. Some openly discussed alternatives to the succession. Ivan recovered. He did not forget a single name. Then in 1560, his first wife Anastasia, the one person in his entire court he seemed to genuinely trust, died. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned. He launched investigations. He interrogated servants. He accused specific families by name. Whether Anastasia was actually poisoned remained an open question for centuries. In the year 2000, Russian scientists exhumed her remains and tested them. They found elevated levels of mercury and lead in her hair and bones. The results are not conclusive. Mercury was present in many common medications of the era, but they suggest that Ivan's suspicion, whatever its origins, was not built entirely on paranoia. After Anastasia's death, the character of Ivan's rule changed. Not gradually. The shift was visible within months. In December 1564, something happened that had never occurred before in Russian political history. The Tsar left. Ivan loaded his treasury, his icons, his family, and a carefully selected group of loyal followers onto a massive wagon train and rode out of Moscow to a fortified estate roughly 70 miles northeast of the capital. Then he sent 2 letters back to the city. The first was addressed to the church leadership and the boyars. In it, Ivan listed every grievance he held against the nobility, every act of disloyalty, every suspected betrayal. Then he announced his abdication. The second letter was addressed directly to the common people of Moscow. It told them plainly that he held no anger toward them, only toward the boyars. This was calculated with precision. It placed the nobility in an impossible position. If they accepted the abdication, they would face a population that had just been told by the Tsar himself that the boyars were responsible for his departure. The commoners of Moscow had already begun flooding into the streets, demanding the boyars bring Ivan back. The boyars had no real choice. They sent a delegation to the estate, begging Ivan to return. Ivan agreed, but he named his price. He would come back only if granted absolute authority to identify and punish treason without review, without appeal, and without any interference from the church or the nobility. They agreed. What followed was the creation of a political structure with no precedent in Russia and very few parallels anywhere in medieval Europe. Ivan divided the entire country in two. One half, called the Zemshina, continued operating under the existing system of government. Boyars administered it. Laws applied. The other half, the Oprichniki, became Ivan's personal territory. He selected its lands himself. He chose which towns, which estates, which sources of revenue fell under his direct control. Within that territory, a different set of rules operated, or more precisely, one rule: Ivan's word. To enforce that authority, he built the Oprichniki. Recruitment was deliberate and specific. Ivan did not draw from the established nobility. He selected men from lower-ranking families, men with no independent power base, men whose entire existence depended on the Tsar's continued favor. Estimates placed their numbers somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 at various points. Their uniforms were black, their horses were black. From their saddles hung 2 symbols: a severed dog's head and a broom. The dog's head meant they would sniff out treason. The broom meant they would sweep it away. They lived together in a compound that Ivan organized like a monastery, with himself as the abbot. They followed schedules of prayer and communal meals. Then they conducted interrogations and executions. The contrast was not accidental. Ivan understood the power of ritual. By framing his enforcers as a religious brotherhood, he placed everything they did within a framework of spiritual purification. Treason was not simply a political crime. It was a sin, and the Oprichniki were instruments of divine correction. Within their territory, the Oprichniki could confiscate property, detain anyone, interrogate anyone, and execute anyone. There was no appeal, no external review, no external review, no mechanism of accountability beyond Ivan himself. Between 1565 and 1569, they dismantled the power of dozens of noble families. Estates were seized. Entire households were relocated or destroyed. The old aristocracy, the very class that had humiliated Ivan as a child, was systematically broken apart. And then Ivan's attention moved north. To understand why Ivan chose Novgorod specifically, you need to understand what Novgorod actually was. For centuries, Novgorod had operated as something genuinely unique within the Russian political landscape, a republic. While Moscow centralized everything around a single ruler, Novgorod governed itself through a popular assembly. Its prince was elected and could be expelled. Merchants, not military lords, held the real influence. The city's trade network stretched from the Baltic coast all the way to Central Asia. That independence ended in 1478, when Ivan's grandfather conquered the city and formally absorbed it into the Muscovite state. He removed the assembly bell, the symbol of Novgorod's self-governance, and had it transported to Moscow. But even after the conquest, Novgorod remained different. Its merchant class maintained international connections, particularly with the Hanseatic League. Its cultural identity stayed distinct. Its citizens remembered what they had once been. Ivan IV knew this. Every ruler since 1478 had known it. Novgorod was obedient, but it was not the same as Moscow. It cooperated, but it remembered. In 1569, but cooperated, but it remembered. A document reached Ivan claiming that Novgorod's archbishop and its leading citizens were plotting to hand the city over to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia's most powerful rival to the West. Modern historians have examined this claim carefully and extensively. The consensus is deeply skeptical. The document may have been fabricated, possibly by rivals of the Novgorodian elite, possibly by Ivan's own agents. The timing was convenient. Ivan needed money to fund his ongoing Livonian war, and Novgorod was extraordinarily wealthy. But here is what matters most when trying to understand what happened next. It did not matter whether the conspiracy was real. What mattered was that Ivan had a document. A document created a justification. A justification activated the machinery of the Oprichnina. And once that machinery was activated, it followed its own internal logic. The question was never whether this was true. The question was only what would happen now. In December 1569, Ivan assembled his forces in Moscow and began the march north. The column moved slowly and deliberately. Ivan brought not only the Oprichniki, but also regular military units and members of his court. The force was large enough to be seen from a great distance. That was intentional. The first town in their path was Klin. What happened at Klin established the template for everything that followed. The Oprichniki entered the town and began killing, not selectively, broadly. Contemporary sources described the slaughter of inhabitants without recorded interrogation or formal charges. Property was seized. Buildings were burned. There was no strategic reason to attack Klin. The town had no connection whatsoever to the alleged Novgorod conspiracy. The purpose was communicative. What happened at Klin would be reported in every town between Moscow and Novgorod within days. Next came Tver. Tver was larger and more significant. The Oprichniki attacked the city's monasteries and churches first. Clergy were killed. Treasuries accumulated over centuries. Icons, liturgical vessels, manuscripts were confiscated. Then the killing expanded to the general population. Sources indicate thousands died over several days. Modern archaeological surveys of mass burial sites near Tver have produced physical evidence consistent with these accounts. Along the entire route, the Oprichniki also systematically destroyed food supplies. Granaries were burned, livestock was slaughtered or driven off. In the middle of a Russian winter, this carried a specific and calculated implication. The towns they passed through would face starvation in the months ahead, whether or not anyone else laid a hand on them. By the time the advance units reached the outskirts of Novgorod, the population inside the city had already heard what was coming. Travelers, refugees, and survivors from Klin and Tver had arrived with their own accounts of what they had witnessed, but there was nowhere for anyone to go. On January 2nd, 1570, the Oprichniki sealed the city completely. Guards were posted at every gate. The walls that had once protected Novgorod from foreign invaders now served an entirely different function. No one was permitted to leave. For 4 days after sealing the city, the Oprichniki did not begin mass operations. They established checkpoints. They confiscated weapons. They identified the homes and businesses of the wealthiest citizens, the most prominent clergy, the most influential merchants. They made lists. On January 6th, Ivan himself entered Novgorod. He went first to the Cathedral of St. Sophia, the spiritual heart of the city, the oldest cathedral in all of Russia. Archbishop Pimen, the head of Novgorod's church, greeted him according to custom, offering a blessing and a cross. Ivan refused the blessing. He accused Pimen to his face of treason. He called him not a shepherd, but a wolf. He ordered Pimen arrested and stripped of his vestments. Then he sat down and ate dinner. The following morning, the operations began. The structure was systematic. This is precisely what distinguishes Novgorod from a conventional military sack. Ivan established a tribunal. Suspects were brought before him in groups, sometimes dozens at a time. They were accused of participating in or having knowledge of the conspiracy to defect to Lithuania. The interrogations followed patterns. Questions were asked, answers were recorded, sentences were delivered. But the outcomes were predetermined. The tribunal existed to create the appearance of process, not to determine guilt. After sentencing, the condemned were taken to the Volkhov River. Victims were bound at the hands and feet. Entire families were tied together. Women were bound to their husbands. Children were bound to their mothers. They were pushed from the bridge or from the riverbank into the freezing water below. The Oprichniki stationed themselves in boats along the river. Anyone who surfaced or drifted toward the bank was forced back under with boat hooks, poles, and axes. This continued every single day. At the same time, the Oprichniki conducted sweeps throughout the entire city. Monasteries were entered and emptied. Icons were collected not for preservation, but because they were frequently decorated with gold leaf and precious stones. Treasuries were cleared out. Warehouses full of trade goods were seized. Merchants who resisted or attempted to conceal assets were subjected to interrogation methods designed to produce compliance. The scope of the operation expanded week by week. Initial targets were clergy and nobles, then wealthy merchants, then ordinary merchants, then ordinary merchants, then anyone with any connection to the initial suspects, then people whose only crime was proximity. The executions at the river continued. Other methods were employed alongside them. Sources describe mass burnings, though specific details vary between accounts. What remains consistent across every source is the scale and the duration. This was not a single day of violence. It lasted approximately 5 weeks. 5 weeks during which every single day people were taken from their homes, processed through a tribunal, and killed. The city's economy was being dismantled in parallel, not as collateral damage, but as deliberate policy. Trade goods were seized, warehouses were emptied, Market infrastructure was physically destroyed. The commercial foundation that had made Novgorod one of the wealthiest cities in northern Europe was being systematically removed. When Ivan finally departed on February 12, 1570, he gave a speech to the surviving population. He told the remaining leaders to pray for his reign and to live in peace. Then he rode south. Behind him, the city had been stripped of its leadership, emptied of its wealth, and reduced in population by thousands. The exact death toll remains disputed. The lowest modern estimates place it at 2,000 to 3,000. Other historians argue for significantly higher figures. The Novgorod Chronicle, period. The Novgorod Chronicle, written by people who lived through it, recorded numbers in the tens of thousands, though these are generally understood to include deaths from the famine and disease that followed, in addition to the direct killings. What happened to Novgorod after Ivan left is in many ways a slower continuation of the same destruction. The city had lost its archbishop, its senior clergy, its wealthiest merchants, and a significant portion of its general population. But the killing was only the most visible layer of the damage. The Oprichniki had confiscated the city's accumulated trade goods. They had destroyed the warehouses and market infrastructure. They had killed or displaced the people who had managed Novgorod's commercial networks. The relationships with Hanseatic traders, Baltic merchants, the connections built across generations that had made the city what it was. Trade networks are not buildings. You cannot reconstruct them with timber and labor. They are relationships, and those relationships were gone. The famine that followed was entirely predictable. The Oprichniki had destroyed food stores along their entire route, not just in Novgorod, but in every town between Moscow and the city. The winter of 1570 brought mass starvation across northwestern Russia. Disease followed the famine. The death toll from these secondary effects almost certainly exceeded the direct killings. Novgorod never recovered its former position, not in Ivan's lifetime, not in any lifetime after. The city that had once been a rival to Moscow, a center of self-governance, a hub of international commerce, became a provincial town. It remains one today. Ought last much longer. In 1571, Crimean Tatar forces launched a major raid on Moscow. The Oprichniki, the force Ivan had built specifically to fight internal enemies, proved completely unable to fight external ones. They had spent years conducting confiscations and executions. They had not trained for open battlefield combat. Moscow burned. Ivan formally dissolved the Oprichnina in 1572. He banned the very word. Anyone who spoke it could face punishment. But the consequences of what the Oprichnina had done, the economic devastation, the destruction of the nobility, the systematic breaking of institutions, those continued to compound long after the organization ceased to exist. When Ivan died in 1584, he left behind a state more centralized than any previous Russian government. He also left behind a state that was economically crippled, politically fractured, and demographically damaged in ways that would take generations to begin to heal. If you made it to the end of this, you already know this channel is not about dates and names. It is about mechanisms. It is about understanding how things actually happen. If that is the kind of history you want, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There is a lot more coming that you do not want to miss.